Welcome to Reaction with me, Iain Martin. This is our Authors in Conversation series where I talk to leading authors about books that have grabbed my attention and that I really want to highlight. And today's guest is Iain Dale, who has just published The Presidents, 250 Years of American Political Leadership. Welcome, Iain, to the
Hi.
show. So, first question is really just about inspiration. What is it about American politics that first grabbed you? You describe it in the book in the introduction that it was travel and just sort of really getting
Mm.
to know the place. But you had this from an early age, a real sense of excitement about American politics and the office.
Well, I grew up in my late teenage years, with the late 70s, early 80s. And Reagan, I just thought was an inspirational figure. Obviously, had this remarkably close relationship with Margaret Thatcher, which we might talk about a little bit later on. Um, and I didn't go to America until 1987, and it was kind of love at first sight. And I was in Detroit, Michigan, and Ann Arbor, which is the home of the University of Michigan, has some amazing secondhand bookshops. And my American friend Mark Milosh took me all around these bookshops, and I just kept buying and buying and buying. And they were all books that I'd never heard of before. They were biographies of American presidents or books about US elections. And I had to buy an extra suitcase to come home, to bring them home. And I just started reading and reading and reading. And particularly Richard Nixon was a president that really fascinated me. And again, the chapter in the book, I think, is a really good portrayal of him. And I think he's one of the more notable presidents, but again, we may come onto him a bit later. So I then spent quite a long time in Washington, D.C. I probably in the 1990s would go twice a year to Washington and just loved all of the different political hangouts. Of course, hardly any of them still exist nowadays. Washington has really declined, I think, as a city. It used to be my favorite city in the world, but I don't think it is any longer. And I got to visit the Oval Office. I think my one claim to fame is that I was the first person to blog from the Oval Office back in probably 2006 or 7, something like that. Admittedly, I only had one foot in it, but I think that counts, doesn't it? Um, and just sort of, I remember going to one of these sort of really fusty old clubs for an event and just passing Henry Kissinger on the stairs. And there is this real, we talk about the Westminster bubble in this country, that there's a real equivalent in America. It's called the Beltway, but it's sort of even more bubbly than I think Westminster is. And if you're in that bubble, you get to know people, and you get to know people who've worked for presidents, you get to know people who've served in their administrations. And the whole thing just fascinated me. Bizarrely, though, over the last 10 years, I've kind of fallen out of love with American politics. I think partly because of the total decline of the Republican Party into a religious sect rather than a political party.
Yeah.
And that it's a bit sad in a way. And I haven't followed presidential elections as closely as I would have done. I would have bought all of the books on presidential elections, but I must admit I haven't really done so for the past couple.
So we're talking about Ian's new book, The Presidents. And so talk us through that. I'm going to come back to you with a question about Washington and its relative decline and why
Yeah,
you think that has happened. But unlike you, I was drawn to it. Just it's the center of power. If you like politics, it seemed
yeah.
for so long to be just an exciting place. So walk us through the idea for the book then. So you've got some amazing writers and contributors to chip in, and they've each submitted a chapter or taken a president and told their life story and evaluated their presidency.
Well, the idea came from my previous book, The Prime Ministers, which we talked about last year, I think. And I wanted to do a follow-up. So, excuse me, I said to the publishers, right, the obvious follow-up is US presidents. They didn't like the idea at all. And they said they didn't think it was commercially viable. And this would have been at the beginning, maybe sort of the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. So I thought, okay, well, I still think it's a good idea. Then they came back to me more or less, middle of, it was just before Trump lost the election, and we were all obsessed by American politics at that time, what was going to happen in the presidential election. And they then decided that everyone in Britain was really interested in in American politics, and therefore it would be commercially viable. So I didn't have as long as I really wanted to put the cast list together, but I think we've got some brilliant contributors. So there's 45 different presidents. People say, why are there 45? Because Joe Biden has always said he's number 46. And it's because Grover Cleveland served 2 separate terms in office at the end of the 19th century. So 45 different contributors, each taking on a different president. Some of the contributors are renowned experts in their subjects, but many just have an interest in them. And it's a mixture of academics, historians, politicians, journalists. And the good thing is, I think with 1 or 2 exceptions, they've all adopted a similar style. It's meant to be a very accessible book, a book that you'll dip into rather than necessarily read from cover to cover. It's not an academic book. There are no footnotes. And it's designed to really awaken people's interest in particular presidents. And if you like what you've read, you might then go and read a proper biography about the person.
Let's talk firstly about the Nixon, the Nixon chapter, and so that's written by Freddie Gray of The Spectator, who knows his American politics inside out. Why is Nixon someone who fascinates you so much? What is it about this tragic character?
I was, I think, 12 years old when Nixon resigned was it August the 9th, I think, 1974. And I remember that. It's one of my first political memories. And I knew something big was happening. I didn't really know the ins and outs of it, but I kind of understood what Watergate was. And then I, as a teenager, sort of observed him try to rehabilitate himself. And when I went to America in 1987, I bought every book that Nixon had ever written and virtually every biography of Nixon that there'd ever been. And I just started reading them. And he is a brilliant writer, a really underrated writer. And his book In the Arena is one of my favorite books of all time. It really sort of talks about what it's like to be in the political game and makes the point, well, if you're not in the arena, you can't make a difference. And I think when he left office, he really missed being at the center of things. And Stephen Ambrose wrote a brilliant book about his supposed rehabilitation from 1974 until his death in 1992, something like that. And I became a bit of an expert on Nixon, and there was part of me that thought, shall I write that chapter myself? But in the end, I didn't. And I think Freddie's done a brilliant job because Nixon was a man of many parts. He was a very impressive politician in many ways, but a deeply unimpressive man in many ways. He didn't have the charm and charisma and personality of someone like Reagan, but he had a driving force. He had an inner belief in himself. But he made himself very unpopular almost from the start of his political career with the Alger Hiss case back in the 1940s, where he was seen as essentially a sub-McCarthyite. And then he became Eisenhower's vice president, a decision that I think Eisenhower at times came to regret. And then he was sort of in and out of politics. He was defeated as governor of California. Remember that famous press conference? He told the press, well, you won't have Nixon to kick around any longer. But within a few years, he was a Republican nominee in 1968. And I think, and I know people laugh when I say this, but if you take Watergate out of the equation, which I know you can't do, but if you take that out of the equation, you would have to say that he has many, many achievements to his name. And instead of being in the bottom quarter of presidents, I think he probably would have been somewhere at the bottom of the top quarter.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I mean, I grew up in an era where just the mention of Nixon's name, it's just that the disgrace had been so complete, so total, so abject that he was regarded by people in the centre or on the centre left as a joke figure. But as you say, he rehabilitated himself. Also, a curious thing in terms of the European left, I suppose applies in the US as well, is that people who are prepared to turn a blind eye to JFK's faults or LBJ's faults were absolutely down on Nixon. There was no light and shade or nuance in terms of his other capabilities or abilities as a politician. I also think what I think is the most interesting thing about him is that period in 1960, someone wrote a very, very good book on it, who we'll reference below and link to. When people always think that JFK invented modern communications techniques and the idea of the candidate who needs a makeover, actually the reality is that the only thing they had to do with JFK was to get him to stop wearing hats. I mean, they didn't need to change his suits. He was a guy who, could be quite scruffy sometimes, but he was a good-looking guy, dressed in a relatively modern fashion, and you just needed to put him on television, and he was a political natural, or he'd taught himself how to speak. But it's Nixon is the guy who needs made over for TV. Nixon's the one who needs the advertising people from Madison Avenue and elsewhere to teach him how to speak and communicate and not look too shifty on camera, which didn't necessarily work in 1960, but by 1968 had worked. So he's a fascinating character. Let's get Trump out of the way, and I think that maybe what's happened to the Republican Party, as you described, Iain, and just the appearance of Trump helps explain the way in which many of us have gone off American politics. But it's Justin Webb who's written the essay on Trump. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, that was actually one of the most difficult to recruit to, because I didn't want somebody who was the diehard Trump supporter. On the other hand, I didn't want somebody who was a virulent opponent. I wanted somebody who could write with a little bit of nuance. And Justin had been North America editor for the BBC before Trump came along, it has to be said. But I just thought if he would do it, he would be the ideal person. I think he's done a tremendous job in that he does actually point out some of Trump's triumphs, or at least sort of achievements, and obviously looks at the darker side as well. And I think there's very few people who manage to do that, because we all have very strong opinions on Donald Trump. He is somebody that you either love or loathe. And I remember when you and I used to do CNN Talk, I found that, I ended up as the person who would always seem to defend Donald Trump in a way, because I thought, well, you can't have three people on a panel just saying the same thing. And even though I might have agreed with everyone else on the panel, I thought, well, let's just play devil's advocate here a little bit from time to time. And there were things that he got right. I think in some, maybe not many, in some aspects of his foreign policy, I think there are some achievements there. Up until the pandemic, you'd have to say there was quite a few economic achievements as well. And people on this side of the Atlantic often don't really see that. They just look at the man himself and think, what a terrible individual. But if you look at his economic records, certainly in the first 3 years, you would have to say it wasn't bad at all. And I think Justin's managed to bring this out in the essay really, really well.
Yeah. And it's if he hadn't, another big if he hadn't mishandled the pandemic in the way that he undoubtedly did, then the historical record could have looked really quite different. He was probably heading for re-election, and he would have been seen to be, he's certainly right, broadly right, not necessarily on the details, but broadly right in his instinct about China and America needing to be more robust with China. I would argue that was the correct response. It's just so ironic that someone, and he is a germaphobe, and theoretically supposed to be kind of interested in these subjects, didn't see the danger of screwing up the pandemic. But actually, I think it's just that they saw it in terms of they were on the route to an election. They were pretty sure they were going to win, and what mattered was the stock market, and what mattered was the economy, and anything which spread fear, they just had to try and dismiss. That turns out to have been a catastrophic set of decisions. I was just going to ask you though, Iain, whether he, and you're right, I found myself in a similar situation in broadcasting. I really didn't like the fact that he was president, but just thought that a lot of the criticism was at times unnecessarily shrill. And you look what's happened since in terms of the very way in which some of the investigations have collapsed or crumbled, or turned out to be, as well, I hate to use the term fake news, but have certainly turned out to be discredited news. Is that the real problem with him in terms of his personality is that he just could not be presidential. And those
Yeah.
of us who like America and think that a strong, sensible America is a force for good in the world, you just look at this guy and he didn't do what most of us anticipated he would do, having won the election, which is that if he's an actor, if it's an act and the Trump show and The Apprentice is a routine, I thought he would want to learn how to become president, but for some reason he didn't. Why do you think that is? Why did he pursue this relentlessly? I was going to say angry, but just the way in which he was so rude about opponents, unnecessarily cruel. Why?
Well, I don't think he expected to be president. I genuinely think he thought Hillary would beat him. And he would have come up with an excuse as to why he didn't win, because obviously winning is everything to him. I remember interviewing him back in 2012 when he was coming to speak in London at the Excel Centre, some business conference. And I interviewed him for about, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes on the phone. And he was sitting at his desk in Trump Tower. I was in the LBC studio in London. And listening back to it, I'm interviewing a normal person, somebody who knows how to play the rules of the game. And it was quite at the end. I remember him saying, did I play golf? I said, yes, I did. Well, you must come and play at my golf course in Scotland. Needless to say, it never happened. But it was a very pleasant interview. And then I remember the inauguration. I was in Washington covering it for LBC. And I thought, like you, that he would make a presidential inauguration speech. Well, how wrong was I? I remember coming off the back of it. And normally, if you're a presenter in those situations, you sum up what the politician has just said. And I remember saying, because I almost didn't know what to say. I just said, normally I would tell you what he's just said and explain it. I said, I can't do that because that was a speech that Benito Mussolini would have been proud to have given, not necessarily in content, but certainly style, this sort of strutting, this bombast that he has. And that was a signal of what was to come. And as you say, he more than anyone else, I think, has ruined public discourse in politics. He didn't play by the rules of the game. Now, his fans would say, well, that's what he was all about. He is a disruptor. He wanted to disrupt the normal way Washington works. Well, he certainly achieved that, but in a very destructive way, in a way that I think led quite a lot of ordinary people to believe that Washington really was corrupt. Now, of course, people believed that before, but he had a way of trying to emphasize that fact, and that all politicians who weren't on his side were inevitably doing it for the wrong in the game for the wrong reasons. Yeah. And I think it will take America a long time to get over Trump, because we haven't seen the last of either him or his ilk, in that his people still have a huge control over the Republican Party. I don't really believe that he'll stand again in 2024. It's possible. But somebody like him will stand, and they will probably be the nominee.
I think several things have happened since he lost that I didn't anticipate, and I think a lot of people. I mean, it's difficult at the moment, isn't it? Not traveling to the US. I feel like I need my pre-pandemic needed a fix of going to America once or twice a year, and it's only by being in. Yes, it's Washington or it's New York, but it's only by sitting with people you've got to live in that news time zone,
right,
and consume the TV and just have a coffee or a beer with an old friend whose judgment you trust, and they'll tell you what's going on or how to view things. And then when you come back from that, you feel then able to opine a bit on, what is ultimately another country's politics. So I don't know, but I expected almost straight after the election his grip on the Republican Party to weaken, because you just thought Republican non-Trump money would sweep in and take over most of the main offices.
It hasn't happened, has it?
And it hasn't happened. He still has control of the RNC and the Republican Party machine. So the impression you get is it's there for him if he wants it, and he seems to be watching the mess that the Democrats are in. And they've got a real mess now, because they've got a candidate who looks pretty weak, but because of the vice president they've chosen, they don't have a default position. If Joe Biden is ill, they cannot nominate Kamala Harris, I don't think. I mean, her ratings are worse than Joe Biden's, and she lost badly in the primaries for a reason. Voters don't don't like her. It just there isn't a connection there.
I wouldn't underestimate her. I think that there is a lot more to her than possibly we think on this side of the Atlantic. I mean, if he fell ill or if he died, she's the automatic president. There's no choice in that. That's the Constitution. And if that happened in, say, in the next 12 months, she would be in an incredibly strong position in 2024. I think it'd be quite difficult for somebody then to dislodge her as possible, I suppose.
I think well, I suppose, Reagan tried, didn't he, in 70, ahead of 76, did challenge Ford for the nomination.
Slightly different circumstances, but almost certainly doomed to fail.
We'll see. As we've learned, anything is possible in the crazy world of American politics in the last few years. I just think that we'll see. I could be wrong, but I just think the way in which she polled for unlikability in the primaries and does now, I think is a real problem. Let's talk about for the Democrats. Let's talk about. I was going to suggest George Bush, but actually, well, it was George Bush, and I'm not going to swear on this broadcast, obviously. But you described being in Washington, watching the Trump inauguration, and we both remember what George Bush called it when he described it as pretty weird something or other, and it was really crazy. But so you've got Colleen Graffy writing about Bush. You've also got, let's talk about Barack Obama.
Colleen Graffy was the first Bush.
It's the first Bush, and you've then got Christopher Mayer, who of course knew the second Bush, and Chris Mayer was there when Blair was having the supper at the.
I mean, he was busy basically getting up George Bush's arse, as Tony Blair instructed him to do.
As Tony Blair and Jonathan Powell, which was actually, don't you think, such a misreading of, I hate to use the term special relationship because it's kind of meaningless, but that's not really the job of the ambassador. That really illustrated the way in which the Blairites, the uber Blairites, had misunderstood American politics, because Margaret Thatcher didn't really take that view, did she? I mean,
I'm not so sure. I think that given that Clinton and Blair had been so close, it was always going to be difficult for Blair to get that same connection with George W. Bush. And in his view, it was so utterly important for the British Prime Minister to be seen as very close to the American president for all sorts of different reasons. And I think Blair managed to achieve that. And so I think that lay behind that particular instruction. I mean, obviously the Iraq War and 9/11 cemented all of that very early on in Bush's presidency. But I think that could have been quite a tricky relationship if they hadn't played it that way.
True.
But you talk about the special relationship, which is a term that I cringe every time I hear it.
Hate it.
If you think, and the theme running through this book, or one of the themes, is the relationship between Britain and the United States, going back to the War of Independence. And I must admit, I hadn't really thought about the relationship between the two countries, particularly in the 19th century. I suppose because I'm a child of the post-war years, I've always just looked at it from Roosevelt onwards, where clearly there has been, if not a special relationship, a very close relationship. There have been one or two aberrations in that, Nixon and Heath, for example. I would say Theresa May and Donald Trump, and maybe up to a point Wilson and LBJ, because Wilson wouldn't send troops to Vietnam. And obviously you've got Eisenhower falling out with Eden over Suez. So there have been sort of dips in this relationship. Even under Margaret Thatcher there was, because everyone thinks now of her and Reagan as being political soulmates. But she had several occasions where she had to really tear him off the strip. Over the invasion of Grenada, for example, in October 1983, where she rang him up and literally tore him off a strip because he hadn't pre-warned her. And the Queen is head of state in Grenada. And she phoned during a cabinet meeting, and she was shouting so loudly at him that he held the phone up to the cabinet minister and said, "Isn't she wonderful?" And I mean, the Falklands was another one where people's memories are slightly false on America's position in the Falklands. We owe everything to Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary. Reagan was under huge pressure from both Al Haig, the Secretary of State, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, the American ambassador at the UN, to be much less pro-British than his instincts told him he should be. Now, in the end, he did come down on the right side, but there were a few scary moments for Britain during that in
Yeah.
its relationship with America.
The global power or ally that was just unquestioningly, unflinchingly there was France, of course. Which it's interesting how, in British political terms, that's misremembered, isn't it? It's become, the myth of it has become American solidarity, and
Yeah,
you can't really trust the French. But it was Mitterrand who was very, very clear about what needed to be done on missiles and
yeah.
espionage and all the rest of it. Just, you were mentioning the 19th century there. I suppose that the period that always fascinates me is that cultural shift, where in the 19th century the Brits, in political and cultural terms, are fascinated by America, but find it a bit comical. But some, big American stars, big British literary stars, people like Oscar Wilde or Dickens as well, become very popular in the US. So the Brits are kind of quizzical about what is this country going to become, and have a bit of a tough time starting when they start to realize how it's going to become maybe the number one economic power. And in that period, and I just wanted to ask you about Woodrow Wilson, in that period, what the First World War really constitutes is the transfer of economic leadership.
Yeah.
It's that period when Britain goes from being a creditor nation to a debtor nation, and essentially it's the US that provides and organizes the war loans and a lot of the financing. And from the First World War, America is the number one economic power. But you've got on Woodrow Wilson, you've got Roy Hattersley.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look back at the relations between Britain, say from the middle of the 19th century through to the First World War, because at times there was a lot of conflict between the two countries over colonial issues. I mean, there was even, I mean, if you think about the Civil War in the 1860s, but going forward about 30 years, there were big disputes with Britain in the 1890s, to the extent that there could have been another war, which nowadays seems unthinkable. But Britain and America were a bit like Britain and France now are, I think, where there was incredible suspicion between the two. And from time to time, a president would come along who would try and repair relations, but often Britain wasn't particularly interested. And I think, and again, you have to think in 1880, well, it was only 100 years since the colonies had been lost. So there was still the overhang of that. And there were a lot of British politicians who couldn't quite cope with the fact that the Americans had prevailed only 100 years before. So all of this sort of melted into the whole discussion about relations between the two countries. And you're right, it was the First World War. That if you want to say, well, when did Britain take a secondary position? It was really then.
Yeah.
And if you think about when Baldwin became Prime Minister in 1923, he had just been to America to renegotiate the war loans. And all of that, I mean, you then go forward to the Second World War, and obviously you've got all that on steroids with all of the loans that we were having to negotiate with America then. And this so-called special relationship, which Winston Churchill coined that term in 1944, it wasn't that special in America giving us preferential terms, because they absolutely did not. They were commercial loans.
And it came with a determination, just to further to your point about the colonial
Yeah.
aspect of it. It came with a demand effectively to dismantle the British Empire. The Brits would have had to do so anyway, but the pressure was there nonetheless. So I don't want to talk about too many presidents who are just up to date, but I'm going to ask you about LBJ, and you've got a very interesting contributor doing that. But I should point out to everyone, we're talking to Iain Dale about the presidents, 250 years of American political leadership, and they're all, it goes without saying, all in there. So there are lots of presidents I'd forgotten about as well. You've got Julia Langdon on Abraham Lincoln, Keith Simpson on James Buchanan, Bonnie Greer on Ulysses Grant, David Torrance on McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt by Damian Collins. Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite American presidents. Interestingly, Damian Collins, of course, is really tough on tech giants in a previous incarnation, running the Media, Culture and Sport Committee. He's fascinated by Teddy Roosevelt because Teddy Roosevelt was a trust buster in terms of taking down.
Yeah, as
Standard Oil.
were quite a lot of presidents from that era. I mean, you could almost divide them into those who were anti-corruption and those who tolerated it because they effectively got power through those means. And if you go, say, from, I don't know, 1870 to 1920, in those 50 years, that was one of the leading issues in American domestic politics, which, well, you could say it ought to be nowadays to an extent, but it isn't. All the sort of Tammany Hall crooked business leaders that were there at the time. And it's absolutely fascinating that this is yet another theme. The other one, which we haven't talked about at all, is of course slavery, which,
Yep.
reading a book like this or editing a book like this, you absolutely see exactly where the Black Lives Matter movement came from. So slavery was an issue under George Washington. It's also an issue under Joe Biden. And there aren't that many issues that you could say transcend the 230 odd years between the two. And the attitudes that each president took to the conflict between the northern states and the Confederacy. Again, I realized how little I knew about American history once I'd actually read all of these different essays, because they just sort of bring it all together in a way that I haven't actually seen done before. So if you're interested in America, you don't know an awful lot about it, you're actually going to learn a hell of a lot from the essays in this book.
So just one final president to mention, LBJ, who of course was right in the middle of it in terms of civil rights movement and the changes that happened in the 60s, well, during the Kennedy administration, and then when he became president after the assassination. So you've got George Osborne writing about LBJ, which is quite a coup.
Well, I knew that George was a real fan of Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of LBJ, and in fact, I think he had a dinner which Caro spoke at in number 11 when he was Chancellor. And so I thought, well, he or William Hague would be brilliant at this. And George was the first to bite. And I think he's done an absolutely superb job. It's quite a personal, I mean, some of these essays, that they're meant to all have a similar style, but there are one or two that are slightly different to the others. And I would say George's is one, but in a very good way, because he does bring his own thoughts and experiences into the chapter, which I quite like the way he did that. And LBJ is just such a fascinating character. I mean, a real powerhouse of a man who came from very, very lowly, lowly upbringing. And he just came to dominate politics. And to the extent that Kennedy, he lost to Kennedy in 1960 for the nomination, but Kennedy didn't feel he had any alternative but to ask LBJ to be vice president, which, when you think about his powerful position in the Senate, was quite a decision for him to make. But of course, he then became president when Kennedy was shot. You can't claim that he was a brilliant president. I mean, George does his best to sort of, I suppose, talk about his achievements, and he did have lots of achievements, particularly in the area of civil rights. But I mean, Vietnam will always cloud LBJ's presidency in the same way that it does really also, I suppose, with Nixon, but slightly less so. LBJ really had the opportunity not to go into Vietnam in the way that they did in the end, and he made the wrong decision.
I just think he's another. I mean, he's another American political tragedy. But what makes him so interesting, I think, is that him as a machine, as a political machine operator, but also where he comes from. And it's another example of someone coming from at that point underdeveloped, theoretically sort of unsophisticated part of America, and learning politics and then taking it to Washington and being arguably better than anyone of his generation at politics and at the political game. There's a great quote at the beginning of your book, Iain, which is LBJ. The presidency has made every man who occupied it, no matter how small, bigger than he was, and no matter how big, not big enough for its demands, which is a really good quote. One final question just before we wrap up, Iain. You indicated you've gone off American politics a bit because of the Trump experience. Do you feel now, broadly, do you feel optimistic about America, or do you think it's got another phase of turmoil to go through before someone emerges who can put America in the take America in the right direction?
I can't be optimistic about a country that managed to have Trump and Biden as the two candidates for president. I can't be optimistic that at the next election it isn't going to be something similar, where you have two very uninspiring people putting themselves forward and somehow they get nominated. The American political system, many would argue, has been in crisis for many, many years. And in a sense, what we're seeing now is a manifestation of that crisis. You have a president, Biden, who, he should not be president. He should never have been. I'm not saying I wanted Bush over him. I didn't. But he's turned out to be exactly what I thought he would be. And his only asset is that he's not Donald Trump. Well, that's not good enough. And to recover from the Trump years, you needed somebody who could genuinely bring the country together, and somebody who was at the top of his game. And whatever anyone says about Biden, you couldn't say that he was at the top of his game.
That's why,
So
I'm
not optimistic. I'm not. I don't feel myself becoming enticed by American politics again. What I am, though, is enticed by American presidential history. And I mean, editing this book has made me want to read biographies of several of the presidents that I frankly knew nothing about before doing the book.
Good point. There's the very, very good chapter by Toby Harnden, who was one of the first, I remember, on the Telegraph to spot the promise of Barack Obama as a potential winner, which of course he went on to become. But I think the reason he's a real disappointment, Obama, is that we thought at the time, whether you were more in favor of the Republicans or the Democrats or just someone who wanted to see a decent American president in office, that America had a special gift for supplying the right person, usually, at a moment of crisis, that somehow magically, for reasons that no one can properly explain, Harry Truman turns out to be as good a president as he was in foreign policy. In foreign policy terms, he's a bit of a genius, I would argue, or Reagan, or Teddy Roosevelt, or Lincoln himself. And then Obama, you think at one point that might be him. He can grow into being a great, but actually turns out not to be particularly.
Well, he could never
good
have
at winning
lived
the
up
job.
He could never have lived up to the hype. And what Sarah Palin, in fact, the only thing I can remember that she ever said, the hopey changey thing. Yeah. That was always going to be a bit of a noose around his neck, and that he could never live up to the expectations of the people that voted for him. I don't think he was a bad president. I don't think he would deserve to be anywhere near the top 10 of American presidents. But it was an achievement in itself as a black man to become president in the first place. So, he had 8 years, and I think it's probably too early to really analyze exactly what his successes and failures were. But he didn't live up to the expectation.
Well, Iain Dale, thank you very much for joining us. You've been watching Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button below. Also, you can visit the site and become a member of Reaction, where you get my weekly newsletter and lots of other great stuff from the team, like Maggie Picano's column, and also Tim Marshall writes on geopolitics for us every Friday. And also, so if you want to buy Iain Dale's new book, The Presidents, really recommend it. It is, as you said, Iain, there are people in it who, although I love American political history, people I was unfamiliar with, there's just so much to get stuck into. There is a link below where you can order a signed copy from Iain Dale. But until next time, thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thanks, Iain.